Hey, everybody, welcome back to another Archaeology month of Archaeology After Dark. I'm, of course, your host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Dr. Stephen Carmody. Stephen, thanks for being here.
I'm happy to be here. Pleasure to join you.
So, Stephen, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I don't know how far you want me to go back.
Whatever you want to throw in there.
Yeah, I started my undergraduate degree at the College of Charleston. Didn't enroll to pursue anthropology and archaeology. I'd actually been out of school for several years and had been in the Merchant Marine, and decided when I was 30 I was going to go back to school, and was really interested, just based on work on boats. I was kind of interested in marine geology, marine biology, and so went to College of Charleston, kind of undecided as a student, and because I'd been out of school for so long, they put me in a program where the school dictated my first 24 hours of academic credit. And the last class they assigned me was Intro to Anthropology. And so I remember taking it, and just, a lot of it was new to me. It was, not something I had as a high school student. And we got into the way the Intro to Anthropology is a 4 subfield discipline is taught, kind of moved through the different subdisciplines, got into archaeology, and just remember thinking, this is something I could do, something I can get paid to do. And so from there, really just kind of, went through that first 24-hour program successfully. And then, from there, just kind of carved out, my undergraduate degree in anthropology. And I think, like a lot of students, wasn't really sure which subdiscipline I was, where my interests really were. And I took a Origins of Agriculture class as an undergraduate. And I think that really kind of solidified my desire to study people through plants. And then was there for 3 years, and left College of Charleston and went and pursued my master's degree and then my dissertation at University of Tennessee. And specifically University of Tennessee, to work with Dr. Candy Hollenbach and, study and train in paleoethnobotany. And now I am associate professor of anthropology at Troy University here in Alabama.
Yeah, you brought up a good point. I think anthropology, this is just my personal opinion, it's something that people don't get introduced to until they get to college. Like a lot of high schools, none of the high schools I've seen offer something like anthropology or archaeology to people who might be interested in it. And then they, end up having to take it as a requirement when they get to college. And they're like, okay, yeah, I'm sold and love this. How can I get more of this?
Yeah, it makes sense, right? Because, we study people. People are interested in people, whether it's today, 10,000 years ago, 3 million. People are interested in humanity. And we talk about this a lot as, on college campuses in terms of administration. How do we recruit? So many kids come to college and they know they want to be a lawyer, they know they want to be a doctor. And so their path is kind of laid out for them. We're kind of behind the 8 ball in a sense. We have to recruit from that intro class, which is a great advantage because if you're in that class, you have the ability to kind of introduce our discipline to students who've never heard about the discipline, which is exciting. But it also means we have to sometimes work a little bit harder for our student body than maybe folks in biology or chemistry or history, disciplines where students have been trained in K through 12 and have that interest and pick that interest up, where they're never introduced to anthropology. And so it does make it a little bit more difficult at the college level. But man, that's a whole other podcast. I don't know how you change that. I don't know how you get anthropology in K through 12. So,
well, you have to introduce legislation and send it through the school system, and we just don't have the time or the energy to do that.
Right. No. I know how you actually do it, but like, how do you become especially archaeology, because you think of, in terms of all the like STEM initiatives, Archaeology really, hits some of those, those nails on the head. And so, some of the work that you and Marcia have been doing, I think really are, promoting and kind of, pushing archaeology into this younger generation, which I think is, fantastic what you guys are doing. And we're happy to be a part of it where we, where and when we can be.
Oh, yeah. We're glad to have you. Anybody who, wants to help, we love to have.
Well, like I say, we're we're excited to go Thursday and excited to have you guys here in February.
Yeah. So what Stephen is talking about, I know a lot of you have heard about our Junior Archaeology Day we did in Florence over the summer. The next one we are going to be doing will be in February, and it will be attached to our overall meeting in Troy. I think the date we said was February 20th.
Oh man, I knew you were going to ask me that. I should have had it pulled up. Let me
honestly, I should have written it down too. That's just the date that stuck to me, and I was like,
I've written in so many emails here recently, asking people about coming. So the reception is going to be Friday, February 17th at the International Arts Center here on Troy campus. The meetings will be held Saturday, February 18th, and we are currently soliciting papers. So if anybody wants to give a paper, let me know. And we'll also post a flyer on the AAS website, Facebook page as soon as we have that ready. And then the Junior Archaeology Day will be Sunday, February 19th. So
okay, so please don't show up in Troy on the 20th and expect us to be there, because that will be a Monday, and I know I probably won't be there.
Now, if you show up on the 20th, we'll put you to work. But we'd rather have you here on the 19th. So.
Yeah, we'll find something for you to do. You won't be just standing there with nothing to do.
Right, right.
So, Stephen, you're an ethnobotanist. What does that mean?
Yeah, so paleoethnobotany is really, as I always say, just kind of a fancy word to say, we study people and plant interactions in the past. And I tell my students this story all the time, and not that it, I was taking an underwater archaeology class at the College of Charleston, and the professor assigned projects for that class, and I was absent the day they passed around the sheet to sign up for projects. And when I got back to class the next class period, that was the only project that was left. And I really didn't know a lot about it. I had taken this class on the origins of agriculture, which was a theory class, and I found it really interesting. This kind of conversations about the role of plants and the people's interaction with plants, and how that may or may not have led to what we call civilization. But the role of plants in agriculture in the development of societies. And so that was largely theoretical, not methodological. And so the class was an underwater archaeology class, so it had to relate back to the theme. And I ended up looking at plant remains from a submerged site in the Mediterranean Sea. And I remember, just being kind of fascinated by the research, what all you could learn from looking at plants. And I think even still today, I always think about that in the context of, why do you study plants? One of the things I hear more often than I'd like to, don't we know what people ate in the past? I hear that, when you tell people what you do, what you study, don't we know what people ate? We do to some extent. And so, what else can we learn about people in the past through the lens of plants? And to me, it's always been, exciting. Everybody finds that lens that they use to explore the past. I think plants to me have always been, again, we say things like exciting and interesting too often, but because people make choices, right? People make choices. And, food is, required from a biological standpoint, but then we also make choices in the foods that we eat, how we go about collecting those, who collects those, how that relates to every other aspect of daily life. And so to me, it's been one of those things that, whether it was working on my thesis that was looking at hunter-gatherer societies in the Middle Archaic period, or my dissertation that was focused more on the origins of agriculture here in the Eastern Woodlands. It's something that's always kind of captivated me. I've never, tired with thinking about those interactions between people and the natural environment. And so, again, it's what what you think about, what you research. And again, and you can't separate it from people's, day-to-day lives.
Yeah, that's something, especially, here in the Southeast, that we, like, especially here in Alabama, since we have such a rich, like, agricultural history here, you can't, separate the people and the plants here. Like, because we've been farming, the same plants for probably 200 or 300 years now.
Right. No, and so I think, when you look back, I think they're all these things that we know and we learn over time, and talking about kind of the K through 12 versus the collegiate experiences and what you're exposed to and what you're not. It wasn't until I was in college that I learned this. Origins of agriculture was something that happened here. Native Americans in the Eastern Woodlands. Because we all kind of learned that Tigris and Euphrates, Fertile Crescent, agriculture was developed independently, and spread around the world. And there's a lot of meaning in those. There's a lot of meaning in those statements. There's a lot of meaning, when we say that, because we think agriculture, had these profound impacts and consequences. We use agriculture, or historically agriculture has been used as a criteria for things like civilization, right? And so, when you start to spread that out and say, well, maybe there are 9 or 10 different centers, right? Then it really allows you to start questioning that those domestication events, the way it's traditionally been taught in North America, that it was this massive leap forward. It allows you to kind of step back a bit and really try to think about what that process looked like and who was involved and where it happened and where not, why not. And so, we're really good when we say the origins of agriculture. We're good with the wheres and the whens because of archaeology, because of radiocarbon dating technology. But the whys and hows, those are the questions that we still don't, fully understand. And so when we talk about, what those processes look like very early on, what those interactions look like on the landscape very early on, those are things that people are still really interested in. So we say today there are 9 or 10 of these independent centers of domestication. That could change in the next 10 or 20 years based on access to regions that we don't have access to today, and better technology and better techniques, and just, more archaeology in general. And we'll know the dates as well. But really, how do we get to those hows and whys of domestication is really interesting to me. And I think most people who study the origins of agriculture and what that transition looks like, those are the questions I think that are really what kind of drives those questions.
Yeah, so I took an agricultural history class in the spring, and it talked a lot about how we transitioned the South to grow certain kinds of things here, because those were the things that we ended up liking to eat, like okra, rice, potatoes, things like that. And I had never actually understood how they grew rice until I read it in one of the books for class.
Yeah. And so, right, some of the crops that you mentioned are crops that were brought to North America from the African continent. And so, right, people brought those plants with them, or those crops came as a part of that process. And it required that knowledge of those plants and the types of ecosystems in which they grew. And I think that's one of those aspects of agriculture when we talk about, right, what agriculture meant for communities in different parts of the world. That's an important, right? That's an important, that innovation, that level of skill, that level of sophistication, that level of knowledge. When we don't fully unpack that and give credit where credit's due to each of those regions, right? It really takes away from those groups. And so to me, I talk, whether it's an intro to anthropology class, whether it's, talks out in the community, whether it's, public talks, a lot of people don't realize that indigenous communities here domesticated plants. And so part of that is because a lot of those plants aren't economically important today, right? It's not your corn, your rice, cotton, right? And so people know sunflower and people know gourds. But when you give credit to the groups that domesticated plants wherever that happened, right? I think there's a real power in that narrative. And there's a reason that we look back to agriculture as being this profound event in the past. So when you tell that story fully, and put it in each one of those regions, I think there's a real power and a real benefit there. And so, I've talked, given talks about, plant domestication at conferences like the Cherokee Conference, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indian Conference. And I had a member of the Eastern Band Cherokee Indians Elder Committee walk up and say, we didn't know, we've never heard of these plants before. And so again, right, that recognition, that acknowledgement that this process that we consider in the Western world to be such a powerful thing, right, to be able to spread that around, I do think there's a real importance to that. And so.
Yeah, and that's something that I don't think people think about when they think about crops or plants here in the United States is no two states are exactly alike. Each state, you have to overcome different environmental challenges to grow things here. Like say you were going to grow cotton or corn here in Alabama, you couldn't necessarily grow those things in say Arizona or New Mexico because the environment doesn't support them.
Yeah, and again, right, that kind of gets back to, I guess, maybe what I've kind of danced around to some extent, right? That knowledge, that knowledge that, was required for these crops to be successful was curated by people. And again, that becomes part of the story. Who knew, who was the primary, who was primarily responsible for understanding the plant world. Right. So there's a power there. Just the ability to move plants around, to understand which ecosystems they worked in and didn't. Because as you say, right, that changes from, state to state, geographic region to geographic region. So being able to successfully domesticate plants requires a lot of time and energy. And again, people think theoretically, people have different theoretical perspectives on what the origins of agriculture looked like, right? And so not everybody would agree with that point. But there were people, right, you could argue, who curated this knowledge, right, that were responsible for the decisions that resulted in plant domestication. And again, that's a theoretical nuance, but again, that becomes important. That becomes an important piece of the story, not just that, well, plants were domesticated here that resulted in this. No, I mean, there were individuals behind those actions. There were individuals that understood what that looked like, and I always give the example, here in the what we call the Eastern Woodlands. Chenopodium was domesticated, right? And so while most people don't know what Chenopodium is, they know what quinoa is, and that's just a South American relative of the Chenopodium that was here in North America, Chenopodium berlandieri, and there were other species as well, album and some others. But we find it during the Paleo-Indian period. So there's 8,000 years you can see where people are using this plant, right, before it becomes domesticated. And so why is that, right? Why does it take 8,000 years? Certainly not people understanding the environment. Certainly not people, lack of, people understood the plant. In other words, people understood the natural world, right? And so that 8,000 year period is really interesting, where you go from people just harvesting this wild plant, and then you see it domesticated, fully domesticated, and all over the region, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And that gets to me to that real human element. When we say the origins of agriculture as this process that brought us domesticated plants, right? That really speaks to that human element that I think is really important in those decision-making processes. And not only with plants like Chenopodium, but then you have plants like maygrass that are native to Florida that we don't ever see kind of the phenotypic or genotypic signature for domestication, but we see spread almost over the continental United States a couple thousand years ago, right? So people understanding how to move it, how to successfully move it and harvest it and plant it. And again, I think those are, just kind of interesting details about the origins of agriculture and people's role in plant domestication that a lot of times gets glossed over because the end result of the process becomes, and so just as that, I don't want to put you to sleep or anybody else, but, the dates we have for agriculture, right? The dates we have for the earliest evidence for domesticated plants, which usually is that phenotypic signature or a genotypic signature, that really reflects the end of that process, right? So that what happens in the middle there, again, I think is what's really interesting in terms of human behavior, people's interaction with the environment and with those plants, right? Like we see the end result that we say by this date and time, we have plant domestication, but that really is the end stage, right? It didn't happen the day before. So what is that lengthy process that took plants from wild, involved them with humans, and then result in that domestication event?
Yeah, and something else that I don't think people think about as much when you're talking about domestication is how much those plants have changed because we domesticated them. Take corn, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, so from what I understand, corn, when people first started domesticating it, didn't taste or look anything like it does now. And it's changed so much over that period to what we have now because of the human influence on it. And another example people use is watermelon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it used to be
So,
a lot smaller, I think is what the deal with watermelon was, but that's just something I had heard.
yeah, and then all plants change through those interactions, right? And so I think with corn in particular, if you put a picture of teosinte up, and then put a picture of corn that we eat today, 18-row corn, it would be, it's hard for people to understand how one transitioned to the other through human interaction. And people have asked the questions about the origins of maize, for a century, because it was hard to look at teosinte and say, here's early, the ancestors of corn. And there's some really interesting stories about that, and about, researchers who thought in kind of, really early on believed that it was teosinte that was, the parents of corn. And, some of the stories, and it's all out there in the literature, but there were people who championed that idea. And, I think it was confirmed, right, once you have DNA evidence, right? There's a long gap between when people were finding these different plants and kind of speculating about how that worked. And then there are of course entire books, Corn and Culture, I think is one, where there, 40 some odd chapters dedicated to this one plant, right? Because it was so, it had such a profound impact on culture, on people. And so when you watch that transition of maize from Central America, right through the Americas, and then, what we learned today about, the corn going from this, early, cob with fewer calories and kernels, to what happens in the Mississippian period, to where, corn becomes more robust, which provides more food, which provides more calories, right? And that's all, again, a result of people. That's all a result of people interacting with that plant in the world in which they live, that, right, is the story of that plant. But corn is one, I think, that here in the Americas is, particularly interesting because of the impact that it had.
Yeah, and especially here in the South, I think cotton is one that people look a lot at just because of its historical influence. That, at one point, our entire Southern economy was not solely based around cotton, but it was largely based around a single crop.
Sure. No, I mean, I think that's one of the the way we talk about, the way we kind of like frame and kind of, how we frame these discussions, right? Sometimes we talk about agriculture as it was this kind of great mistake. And that goes back to Jared Diamond's articles, agriculture was the greatest mistake in the history of the human world. And, you're seeing that idea kind of play out today. If you've kind of followed some of these protests in Europe with milk, right? That's all about humans' interaction with the natural world and with animals and with plants, right? So we see, these ideas that we have to go green, right? These are all kind of results, like, back end conversations about agriculture, which is really fascinating. When we talk about, your economy being based on a plant, and I'll forget the numbers, so I'm going to speak kind of loosely when I use these percentages. 90% of the world's calories are produced from 3 plants. That's remarkable. That's remarkable to think that, right, through these domestication events, you have 3 plants that produce 90% of the world's calories. I think it's estimated that like 60% of the world's calories come from corn alone. And corn is not just in food, right? So between corn and rice, and wheat, you feed the world with these couple of plants, which again is a remarkable legacy of plant domestication. Right now, the flip side of that conversation is, what have we done to the Earth's biodiversity? Right, and so you see that kind of as a consequence of agriculture, that we say hunter-gatherers maybe relied on. I've seen numbers as high as 3,000 or 4,000 wild plants and animals, and today, we've reduced that biodiversity to, I mean, if I ask you to name 20 plants that you eat, could you get to 20? Maybe, I don't know. Probably in animals, right? I can see you thinking about it right now. I can see in your head like 20 plants that I eat, right? And animals is probably fewer, right? Because the same thing happened on the animal side of things, which is by no means my area of research, right? But if you talk about the economically important animals today, right? You go cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, goats.
Yeah, and those are the animals that I eat. I try not to deviate from those unless I have to.
Right, and fish maybe, right? But that's also whether it's wild, whether versus whether it's farmed. But those are the kind of conversations, right? When we talk about the origins of agriculture, right? It's either this incredible event, this great leap forward that freed us from, right, the hunting gathering lifestyle, this kind of older traditional idea. Right, but then today you see people having that same conversation in the context of what have we done, like environmentally, what have we done, right? Again, whether it's I could go on and on, I won't, but whether it's the effects of fertilizers and agrochemicals on the environment, whether it's the reduction in biodiversity of plants and animals, or again like these protests where people are dumping milk on the floor of grocery stores. that is an origin of agriculture. That is a result of the origin of agriculture, or animal domestication. But it gets back to those human plant animal interactions. So again, I think it's there's so much there that makes it a very exciting area of study.
Yeah. So Stephen, I'm gonna wrap this up. So say people wanted to learn more about ethnobotany, botany, or agriculture in general, what would you recommend that they do? Where could they go to learn more?
That's a good question. That's a good question. What's that?
Grocery store.
Grocery store, right? You can see the effects.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of, there are a lot of books, a lot of great books out there that aren't, academic in nature. And again, I think that it's kind of this back and forth conversation about, in a healthy conversation, what did we do through this process? But I think that's just where we are in general. But there are lots of, for students that are, students of anthropology, right, there's a lot of academic resources out there. But then for folks who aren't in the academic, community, there's books and television shows and movies. It's not always framed as an origins of agriculture, right? But that's what these conversations go back to. I tell my students, and when I teach the origins of agriculture class, throw a problem at me in contemporary society, and I can take it back to the origins of agriculture. It may be a long, circuitous path, but I can get you back to that event. Coming out of a pandemic, how does that relate to the origins of agriculture? So all of the things that we see today, right, we can kind of draw back to that event. And again, that kind of goes back to the way, the profound impact we think agriculture had on human societies.
Well, I think that's just about going to do it for us today. Stephen, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me, and hope to see you and a lot of your listeners in Troy in February for the conference, for the Alabama Archaeological Society conference.
Yeah, everybody, be sure to stay alert for those dates. It is in February, so I know it's a little ways away, but these are things that you need to plan of, weeks, months ahead of time, so you actually can be there to get the full effect of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having me, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being here, Stephen.